Jerry, this is Jeff Hirsch live at the courthouse.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff. You know, there had been some talk over the weekend. People were looking for some increased drama here, and I even heard this one scenario that all of a sudden the back doors would open and in would walk Pete Rose, you know, hand on the Bible, making his last plea to say, look, I never bet on baseball. Judge, give me 14 days to prove that Giamatti is in fact biased. That kind of theater is very unlikely, and what made me think about it is the fact that Dowd is not there today. In other words, they would have to tell the judge ahead of time what witnesses are going to show up. So obviously witnesses will not be there today. So I think it's going to be a cut and dry ruling one way or the other.
And there's also been a lot of talk over the weekend that perhaps Pete would hang it up today after this or whatever. But that isn't going to happen either. I think what we're going to see is a possibly long drawn out. Will depend on whether Judge Nadel grants the TRO. But it is not going to be quick and painless no matter what happens here.
This whole case has been nothing but a series of grand surprises. But Pete has stated unequivocally that regardless of what the decision is, he wants to be in baseball and he is not going to quit whatever happens. Let's now go to the courtroom where Judge Nadel apparently is getting ready to walk in. And there he is.
This court to be operating on Sunday, but I think it is clear that this is a highly unusual situation, to say the least. This is case number A8905178. It's Peter Edward Rose versus A. Bartlett Giamatti et al. Now, before we render our decision here today on the issue of whether to issue a temporary restraining order, I would just like to mention something about the attorneys involved in this case. The two lead trial counsel for the parties, Robert Stackler and Louis Hoynes, are not only great legal warriors, but they are two of the most honorable gentlemen that I have ever had the honor to work with in a very, very difficult situation. In addition, the other attorneys involved here for the plaintiff, William Seitz, Robert Pitcairn, Reuben Katz, Roger Makeley, and for the defendants, Lawrence Kamine, Jonathan Wolford, Gerald Weigel, Lawrence Ellman, Robert S. Martin, Mark McDonald, and K.C. Green, are also the highest cream of the legal crop. So perhaps it is fitting that we have such great talent in an unprecedented legal battle that may or may not be just beginning. Before we discuss the specific issues involved, it should be pointed out that we are here at a very initial stage of the case. And as we all know, during the 2 days of evidence, we heard a lot of opinion, we heard a lot of hearsay testimony, and all of which I might add is proper at this early point. However, we did not hear from two of the key parties. That is, Peter Edward Rose and the Commissioner of Baseball, A. Bartlett Giamatti. We would like also to point out that a central issue at this time is not whether Peter Edward Rose did or did not bet on baseball, but rather we are here today deciding issues involving fairness, impartiality, and equity. I also would like to point out that any ruling that we make here today with reference to a temporary restraining order does not in any way forecast what might happen in any future hearing or proceeding before this court. In order for this court to issue a temporary restraining order, several determinations must be made, and we will begin here by making the determinations on the least difficult issues. Number one, if there is a hearing before the Commissioner of Baseball tomorrow, it is this court's judgment that the career of Peter Edward Rose will be irreparably harmed. Secondly, if we grant a delay here today of 14 days, neither Major League Baseball nor the public will be harmed. Thirdly, we must decide if we should even be here today. That is, should this court be sticking its nose into the affairs of Major League Baseball? As we all know, as counsel for all the parties very well know, courts are reluctant to interfere in matters of this sort because of the possibility that the floodgates of litigation will be opened. However, this court will never let that factor deter it from doing what is right and fair. And we now reach the most crucial and most difficult issue for this court to decide, and I might add, this issue involves the closest call for this court in this lawsuit so far. That is, has Peter Edward Rose established his claim for purposes of these proceedings that the Commissioner of Baseball is not an impartial and unbiased decision maker in baseball's proceedings against Mr. Rose? On this point, the strongest evidence for Peter Edward Rose is this letter, Exhibit G, and this is the letter that was written by the Commissioner of Baseball to Judge Carl Rubin on behalf of Ron Peters, and Ron Peters is Peter Edward Rose's chief accuser. I will now read the pertinent parts of this letter for purposes of these proceedings. And the Commissioner of Baseball to Judge Rubin says as follows: "It is my purpose to bring to your attention the significant and truthful cooperation Mr. Peters has provided to my special counsel, who is conducting the investigation into allegations concerning the conduct and activities of Pete Rose, the manager of the Cincinnati Reds Baseball Club." The Commissioner of Baseball goes on to say to Judge Rubin, "I am satisfied Mr. Peters has been candid, forthright, and truthful with my special counsel. It therefore appears to this court at this point that the Commissioner of Baseball has prejudged Peter Edward Rose. We further find that the hearing set tomorrow in New York before the Commissioner of Baseball would be futile and illusory, and the outcome a foregone conclusion. Accordingly, I here today grant Peter Edward Rose's motion for a temporary restraining order. The action I have taken here today has the following ramifications during the term of the temporary order, which is 14 days. Number one, Peter Edward Rose will not have a hearing tomorrow before the Commissioner of Baseball. Number two, no disciplinary action of any type may be taken against Mr. Rose for 14 days. Number three, Mr. Rose will remain as manager of the Cincinnati Reds in their employment for the next 14 days. In addition, the court hereby sets this matter for hearing on plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction on July 6, 1989 at 10 a.m. And the court at this time would like to file the temporary restraining order with the clerk, Mr. Daffron. And here's an extra copy. Here are copies for counsel. Very well, the record should indicate we have now filed the temporary restraining order with the clerk. If counsel wishes to take up any other matters of scheduling, I will be available in chambers. I will only be available in chambers to counsel, to my staff, that is, my court reporter, Mrs. Womack, my constable, Mrs. O'Mara, or Mr. Donovan, my bailiff, or Mr. Daffron, the clerk. Very well, at this time, Mr. Donovan, if you would adjourn court.
And there you have it. Judge Nadel has just granted the temporary restraining order requested by Pete Rose's lawyers. That means the big meeting that was supposed to happen tomorrow in New York City between Pete and Bart Giamatti will not happen. Pete's lawyers asked it to be blocked because they say Giamatti has already made up his mind and cannot be fair to Pete. And apparently Judge Nadel has found reason to go along with that decision.
And the reasons being that he feels that Bart Giamatti has prejudged Pete. That is the major reason that he gave.
We should also point out that what he said, however, does not necessarily mean how he will rule on July 6th when the preliminary injunction hearing will be held. But for now, Pete Rose is still the manager of the Cincinnati Reds and must remain so for another 14 days. So now the judge has 2 weeks in which he must decide which action he will take ultimately, whether to issue a permanent injunction, and that will be the official decision banning Giamatti from the Rose investigation. But of course, baseball could appeal that decision. Tell you what, let's go to Jeff Hirsch, who's now standing by outside the courtroom. Jeff, what do you think?
Well, Jerry, the other day when Judge Nadel took this under advisement, he said that this case could put him into previously uncharted waters. Well, what happened today was he stuck his toe into those previously uncharted waters and then dove in head first. This is truly an historic decision, even though it postpones the real decision for just a couple of weeks. The key argument to baseball's case was not necessarily whether it had or had not the evidence against Pete Rose as of this time, but rather baseball historically has been able to operate on its own and do its own internal discipline. This, at least for now, has been put on hold. There were a whole lot of Reds fans here, Pete Rose fans, I should say. One of them sitting right next to me, a gentleman named Rick Carr, who was here the other day. You weren't even in the courtroom. You were sitting out here watching it. What is your reaction to what happened?
They wouldn't let us in, but from outside watching on the monitors, I'm thrilled to death. Pete, we're all Pete Rose fans here, and I think he needed this restraining order, and I think it's good for him and good for baseball.
Do you feel that Bart Giamatti is prejudiced against Pete Rose, or do you feel you heard John Dowd's evidence, you've read it? Do you feel that Pete Rose did some things he shouldn't have done?
I feel that the letter basically says that Giamatti is already made his judgment, and I'm still sticking on. It's hard with all the Dowd's evidence to stick on Rose's side, but I'm going to, because of what he said about putting his hand on the Bible and saying that, you know, he wants to get up there and testify that he'll be coaching the Reds for the next 10 years. So.
Well, he will be managing the Reds at least for the next 2 weeks. What happens after that, we don't know. There will be another hearing in 2 weeks. The key to Judge Nadel's decision was the letter that Bart Giamatti wrote to Judge Rubin, in which he said that Ron Peters, Pete Rose's chief accuser, had given candid and truthful information. Now, you saw Steve Farr's story a few minutes ago where he interviewed Frank DeFord, who did a very highly laudatory profile of Giamatti in Sports Illustrated a few weeks ago, and even Frank DeFord admitted that he thought that letter was a mistake. That was the key that Pete Rose's lawyers hit on. They spent an hour and a half going over that with John Dowd. Dowd defended himself, defended the letter, but basically that was the letter that hung it up. And we'll be back again in 2 weeks. This is Jeff Hirsch live at the courthouse.
Jeff, let me just try something, and I don't know if it's going to work. I see behind you Bill Cunningham standing. I understand Bill Cunningham spoke with Pete Rose this weekend. If you could, can you see him behind you? If you can just
Bill?
grab him.
Okay.
Just let me ask him one question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay.
I'll relay the question.
Okay, I understand that he spoke to Pete Rose over the weekend rather extensively about what may or may not happen. I'd like to get his reaction to what Pete's going to do now.
Jerry asked that apparently you did talk to Pete over the weekend, and based on what he said then and what you've heard today, what do you think the reaction of Pete is? It's obviously he'd be happy, but what were his feelings going into this?
I think he was cautiously optimistic. He believed that this judge, under these circumstances, in this building, where this building's located, and considering who Pete Rose is, would grant the TRO. And you and I have been around the courthouse for a while, and I think you and I understand that this particular judge is particularly sensitive to the wishes of the voters and or the fans.
Well, is this a classic case of the home field advantage? If this lawsuit was in federal court, let's say even in Cincinnati or in New York where Major League Baseball is located, would this not have happened the way it happened today? Oh, you can only guess, but is it a good guess?
Jeff and Jerry, Norma, you could line up 100 law professors, judges, lawyers. The vote would have been 99-1, and that one is the one that counts. Considered legal opinions would be that there is no way this judge can grant on these legal issues this particular relief. But as he said, this is a terribly unusual case. This is Pete Rose, and I think this judge would be hard-pressed not to grant the TRO because of his character and the kind of turmoil this city has gone through and the kind of personality of Pete Rose. And I think Pete asked for 14 days. He gave him about 11. And now the hearing in a couple of weeks will be dramatic. Giamatti's going to have to testify. Pete Rose, well, I spoke to Pete Rose's lawyers just before the proceeding, and they said Pete Rose would testify at the preliminary injunction hearing. We have all the issues of Mrs. Schott, of Steve Schott. We have the issues involving the complaint. As you know, and as Jerry knows, he's a lawyer, you can join the preliminary injunction with the trial on the merits. And one of the issues in the complaint is whether Pete Rose bet on baseball. And that could be the issue in 2 weeks, but you don't know. It depends how he limits it. But right now, the drama has just begun in this case.
Yeah, that's indeed the case. You know, people have referred to something like this as a media circus, and indeed it has been. But if Pete Rose and Bart Giamatti testify, this has just been a little carnival. The circus is yet to come. This is Jeff Hirsch live at the Hamilton County Courthouse.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff. We may be getting back to you later on as we continue our coverage on what is a dramatic development. Norma?
No, we sent News 5's Michael Collins out to get some reaction from the baseball fans. He's live at a pregame brunch going on right now at Barleycorns, the yacht club in Newport. Mike, they just saw the rulings. What's being said there?
Well, Norma, you know, it goes without saying that Pete has helped put this city on the map, and he's part of us. And I think if you've noticed over the last couple of months, the national media has really pointed out that the people in Cincinnati have really put blinders on when it comes to Pete Rose and this entire controversy, that we've, you know, ignored the evidence and just stood behind Pete when things were saying that Pete was gambling. We've talked to some people here today, and they're not surprised by what they've just heard and seen on the television as far as the hearing goes. Is that right?
That's right.
Why not?
Because in Cincinnati, he couldn't lose. He just can't lose. Other than Cincinnati, he would have lost.
We talked before, and you're not surprised at the allegations either, are you?
No, I think Pete Rose is guilty. I don't have any doubt that he's guilty. I just don't see a person not being who bets football, basketball, track, goes to the racetrack. He also bets baseball.
What do you think?
He deserves a fair chance. I mean, he is guilty of gambling, but he shouldn't be penalized the rest of his life for baseball. Everybody makes mistakes. He deserves a fair chance to tell his side of the story.
There's been a couple of polls over the last couple of days asking whether or not Pete should resign. And they seem to be split right down the middle. Some people say he should, some people say he shouldn't. What do you think?
I think he should stick with it and fight the game. I believe all the pro athletes are involved in things like this, and everybody for his own.
Were you surprised when all these allegations came out?
Yes, I was. I think he's a phenomenal baseball player, and I think that he should have his chance to vindicate himself, though, even though these allegations have been put into the public eye.
Very quickly, one more question. Do you think he would have been prejudged had he gone to that hearing tomorrow with Giamatti?
He would have been out of baseball after tomorrow.
Yes, he would have. Most definitely.
Some fan reactions, very just. Pete Rose is part of Cincinnati. Norma, Jerry?
All right, a lot of people with a lot of diverse opinions on this subject. Now, we've asked an expert in sports law to join us now for some perspective on all of this.
And Ed Goggin joins us again from Chase Law School. Ed, you surprised?
Not really, because I thought there was enough in the record to justify the decision.
I'm sorry. Let me interrupt you one more second.
Okay.
I just got word. Let's go back to Jeff at the courthouse. Jeff?
We have Robert Stackler here, Pete Rose's lawyer.
That we've made up our mind about Pete Rose's guilt or innocence. What would you like to tell them?
I think those people would like to see Pete Rose get a fair hearing on that issue before an impartial decision maker. And the reason we didn't put on any evidence regarding betting in this hearing, that wasn't the issue. The issue here was whether we were entitled to a hearing before a fair and impartial decision maker, whether Commissioner Giamatti was a fair and impartial decision maker, and the document that he signed is clear and unambiguous that he prejudged the charges made against
Flat out, John Dowd says his evidence has Pete Rose betting. Did Pete Rose bet on baseball?
When would you be able to put on your case?
The ball game.
What are you going to tell him now? You're going to be in judgment.
The ball game is beginning right now.
Did Pete bet on baseball?
Pardon me.
Did Pete Rose bet on baseball? Well, as you can see, it's chaos here, and Mr. Stackler's trying to get out of here. He's going around our camera here, and I'm getting cut off here, left and right. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to just go around here. This is live television. As you see it, it's somewhat chaotic, but that's the way things work. Robert Stackler, that was the man you were just hearing. Pete Rose's lawyer, the man who argued successfully to get the temporary restraining order, the man who hammered away at the letter that Bart Giamatti had written to the letter that John Dowd had written to Judge Rubin on behalf of Bart Giamatti, signed by Bart Giamatti, saying that Ron Peters, the chief accuser of Pete Rose, had told the truth. Ron Peters said that he was Pete Rose's principal bookie. Robert Stackler argued that that letter, which Judge Rubin was given from Bart Giamatti believing him, saying the hearing Monday could not be fair because Bart Giamatti was prejudiced, has made up his mind. Well, Judge Nadel agreed, and that's why this thing's been put off for a couple of weeks. This is Jeff Hirsch live at the courthouse, and Jerry, I must say, in the melee and the crowd crush, I've lost my audio, so if you want to ask me a question, give me 2 or 3 minutes to hook myself up and then come back to me. This is Jeff Hirsch live at the courthouse.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. He gets hazard pay for that type of thing. Now, we were speaking with an expert in sports law. Let's go back to that.
Ed, sorry for the interruption. You can understand what's going on today. 2 things strike me as being pretty interesting in this. The first is, up to now, we have constantly heard that this hearing is about whether or not Giamatti can be objective, whether he can be fair. But what Judge Nadel was saying is that now comes the hearing 14 days from now, or July 6th, actually, 10 days from now. In that hearing, the issue, for the first time, we are going to hear from Giamatti. We're going to hear from Pete Rose, because in this kind of a hearing, they can bring in the evidence. This may be the most dramatic of all.
I'm sure it is, but I'm not absolutely sure what you're saying is the way it's going to happen. Are we talking still about the issue of whether or not Giamatti has prejudged the case?
Yes, but
rather than whether or not Pete is guilty or innocent.
That's right, but now in determining whether or not Bart Giamatti can be a fair judge, they are going to talk about the kind of evidence that Bart Giamatti has in front of him and whether or not that was deduced fairly. in that kind of a case, they may have to bring Bart Giamatti to the stand. In other words, Judge Nadel may well say, okay, the only way I can find out if Bart Giamatti is going to be fair is if I can face him eye to eye and look at him and ask him these questions. Well, once Bart Giamatti starts bringing up some of the issues in this particular case, then it seems the door has been opened. And we, just as Bill Cunningham had said, we may very well see the issues joined in this preliminary injunction.
Well, as he's indicated, the hearing can be open to a full evidentiary hearing, so that, yes, Pete would be required to submit to cross-examination and things of that sort at that point.
One of the things you were talking about before the hearing started, and you turned out to be exactly right on, is the judge ultimately made his decision. In fact, his very first sentence almost seemed to be what we were talking about. He concluded at this point, without judging Pete Rose, whether or not he gambled or not, he determined that a 2-week delay would not irreparably harm Major League Baseball. But without granting the order, it could irreparably harm Pete Rose.
Well, because Rose would be subjected to lifetime suspension, a lifetime sentence. You cannot be associated with football, with baseball again, and that would never be put aside.
Has Judge Nadel opened up the floodgates? Has he created new law in his decision?
No, because these things have happened before, much as the Baseball Commission likes to pretend that these types of proceedings have never been interfered with in the past. They have.
Do you see this as more than a hometown decision? Is there any legal basis for what Nadel ruled?
I had sat through the 2 days of hearings, and I was convinced that Dowd's report was very much biased in favor of getting Pete off the field.
Why do you reach that conclusion?
He summarizes all of his evidence in the first 6 pages and concludes, in essence, that Pete was guilty of betting on baseball and Pete was guilty of betting on the Reds. Okay. And then he goes on to explain that in the next 219 pages.
Okay. There are people sitting at home that say, gosh, I've loved Pete all my life, greatest thing going, but their fingerprints on a betting sheet, wouldn't that prove it? What's wrong with that evidence?
Well, if they only have Pete's fingerprints on there, how did they get on there, and why aren't there anybody else's fingerprints on there? The person who supposedly took that information from Pete's house would have to have had his fingerprints on the document also, unless he did it without, had done something in advance, put on a pair of gloves to avoid his fingerprints showing up on that particular document.
So, in conclusion, you find that Judge Nadel's decision has merit?
I feel it does, yes.
Okay. Edgar, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Mama.
For those of you that have joined us late, let's reiterate what's going on here. What we're going to do now is 23 or 24 minutes ago, Judge Nadel rendered his decision. You would probably like to hear that again, so here it is.
Accordingly, I here today grant Peter Edward Rose's motion for a temporary restraining order. The action I have taken here today has the following ramifications during the term of the temporary order, which is 14 days. Number 1, Peter Edward Rose will not have a hearing tomorrow before the Commissioner of Baseball. Number 2, no disciplinary action of any type may be taken against Mr. Rose for 14 days. Number 3, Mr. Rose will remain as manager of the Cincinnati Reds in their employment for the next 14 days.
So this latest chapter in the Pete Rose controversy is now over, or perhaps should I say just beginning. And of course, our coverage of it is just beginning as well. We're going to be getting reaction from Pete. He's at the ballpark today.
And there's some poetry in that, because today is Old Timers Day. So Pete is spending a lot of time being with the people that were with him playing as part of his career. He at least has 2 more weeks as manager of the Cincinnati Reds. Now in 2 weeks, Judge Nadel will decide if he will issue a permanent injunction. So stay tuned for News 5 for complete reports as this story continues to develop.
And that is our special report for now. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Norma Rashid.
And I'm Jerry Springer. For more news, tune in at 6 o'clock. Good afternoon.
Pete's bet on baseball is now public. Judge Norbert Nadel had been keeping the document secret, saying it had private information about people not involved in the Rose case. But faced with an Ohio Supreme Court order to release the document today or justify why not, Nadel let it go.
In view of the time constraints given to us by the Supreme Court, we've discussed this with counsel, I feel that we have no other alternative but to release the material, and as of 5 o'clock, this material will become a matter of public record.
Well, John London is in our newsroom right now, and he has a copy of the report that we just got a hold of. John?
Jerry, we have obtained a copy of it. As you say, it is a thick copy. It's volume 1 of 9 volumes. It is 225 pages. This is the report that Judge Nadel ordered released at 5 o'clock. And in it, it says, as John Dowd testified to during the past few days here in Cincinnati, that Pete bet on Major League Baseball and on the Reds. That is what baseball's investigator is saying. In fact, take a look here at part of the summary of the report, what Dowd says. The testimony, he says, and the documentary evidence gathered in the course of the investigation demonstrates that Pete Rose bet on baseball, and in particular on games of the Reds Baseball Club during the 1985, 86, and 87 seasons. Now, the report also goes into Pete's relationship with a man by the name of Michael Bertolini. Michael Bertolini, we are told, lives in New York, and the report says that he in turn placed bets on Rose's behalf with an unidentified bookmaker in New York City. Quoting from the report now, Rose's financial records reveal checks in the amounts described by Bertolini made out by Rose to fictitious payees. Rose denied placing bets with Bertolini and denied owing anyone money. He did, however, acknowledge that he sent 11 $8,000 checks to Bertolini, but said that those were for loans for payments to athletes for a baseball card show. Now, I want to read you just a brief portion of the report with regard to Ron Peters' testimony. It says here that Peters testified that he took bets from Pete during the period from late 84 to late 86 when he stopped taking Rose's action. He stated that Pete Rose bet on professional football, college basketball, and Major League Baseball, specifically on the Reds 85, 86, or specifically on Major League Baseball games 85, 86, 87, including games by the Reds. And then goes on to say that although Tommy Giosa usually placed the bets for Rose during this period, on 4 to 6 occasions, Rose contacted Peters directly. On one of these occasions, in 85 or 86, quoting from the report again, Pete Rose called Peters to place bets on baseball, including the Reds. Peters recorded the conversation, then played the tape back to Pete Rose. Rose became upset, asked why he had taped him. Peters explained to him that he wanted an insurance policy to make sure Rose would pay his gambling losses. The report concludes at that point saying the tape, however, cannot be located. In the back of the report, it lists 15 instances of corroboration of Ron Peters' testimony, including, it says, betting sheets obtained from Rose's home and found by an expert to be in Rose's handwriting. It says the betting sheets contain a listing of Major League Baseball games, including the games of the Reds, with the results. As I say, we just got this voluminous report just a short time ago. We're in the process of reading through it, and we'll have more information about what it contains later on tonight.
John, I understand that this report, just to put things into perspective so we don't go around convicting anybody here, this is what the John Dowd has come up with in his report. There is still the opportunity for Pete Rose to answer these allegations, and as I understand it, he's going to deny what's in the report.
Oh, absolutely, and that has been made pretty clear over the past few days in court, and also it is alluded to in here. As you read through, you see allegation, and then Dowd lists some of Pete's responses to that, and in every case, as in the case with Michael Bertolini in New York, he has denied it.
Okay, thank you very much, John. John London reporting from the newsroom. As we said, we just got hold of the report. It's 250-some-odd pages. It's going to take an awful long time to read. We will have more of a report on it as we study it more tonight at 11 o'clock.
Well, so now we finally are learning just what baseball has on Pete when the report is released now. And there are other developments in this as well. News 5's Jeff Hirsch joins us now live to show us how lawyers for Major League Baseball made a highly unusual move today to fight the latest ruling on Pete's favor. Jeff?
Well, Norma, as you know, Pete Rose was supposed to be in New York today, and Bart Giamatti was supposed to have John Dowd's 225 pages right in his hand and confront him with it. That didn't happen because Judge Norbert Nadel postponed everything. Nadel gave a temporary restraining order saying that the commissioner could not hold the hearing at least for a couple of weeks till Nadel decided whether it was fair for him or not. Major League Baseball went into court today, tried to overturn Judge Nadel's ruling, saying that Judge Nadel's decision was improper and illegal.
We further find that the hearing set tomorrow in New York before the Commissioner of Baseball would be futile and illusory, and the outcome a foregone conclusion.
And with that, Judge Norbert Nadel blocked today's scheduled meeting between Pete Rose and Bart Giamatti over Rose's alleged gambling. Nadel set another court hearing on the issue for July 6th. But today, baseball appealed, asking Judge Nadel's order be thrown out and that the showdown between Rose and Giamatti go forward as quickly as possible. Quote,
The image of a sport no longer capable of policing itself in a matter as serious as a manager betting on his own team's games could only erode public confidence and respect for the national pastime. The ability of the commissioner to protect the integrity of baseball, the purpose for which his office was created, is at stake, unquote. Baseball is trying to get a temporary restraining order suspended. Legal experts say that's not easy.
Very tough to appeal a granting of a temporary restraining order. They're going to have to exercise some mental muscle and go through some legal gymnastics to do that. But it's doable. Not usual, but doable.
Lawyers for Pete Rose have until Wednesday morning to file their paperwork. Then the Court of Appeals will decide.
Of course, it's unknown when the Court of Appeals will decide. Baseball is hoping it will decide before July 6th. One other thing, which is lost in all of this stuff with the report and with the baseball appeal, Pete Rose is also the subject of a federal grand jury investigation about taxes. So that's a whole other issue which has kind of been lost in all of this. But we must stress, as you have, Jerry, that Pete Rose maintains his innocence throughout. This is Jeff Hirsch live at the Hamilton County Courthouse.
All right, thanks a lot, Jeff. Of course, still on that part of it. Jerry?
Well, most of what's been happening to Pete Rose is going on in court and not on the baseball field, but that's where Pete is now, and Ken's here to tell us how things are going down at the stadium.
Reds and Dodgers began just a little while ago, last game in a 4-game set. Let's go to Tom Brenneman, who's standing by live right now. He had a chance to talk to Pete over the weekend. Tom?
Well, Kenny, today, as far as today is concerned, Rose was in a meeting for better than 3 hours with General Manager Murray Cook and his coaching staff. You get the feeling that a trade might be in the works in talking about baseball between possibly even the Reds and the Dodgers. We'll see about that a little bit later. Pete's not talking to anyone today, but yesterday he did get together in an exclusive News 5 interview with our lonesome George Vogel. Pete told George this whole mess has hurt his reputation and had a story to prove it.
Well, we were in L.A. Last week and a half ago, and we landed at the airport, and Jeff Ruby and his wife was with me, and my wife and my little boy, and we got in this cab, and there was an African driving, and he's been in this country for like 5, 6 years. And Jeff, I was sitting in the front with my son, and Jeff was teasing. He said, you know who Jeff Ruby is, a famous restaurateur in Cincinnati, Ohio? And the guy says, no, sir, I don't think so. He says, you know who Johnny Bench is? And the guy says, no, I don't think so. And we went about another 2 miles, and he said, you know who Pete Rose is? And the guy said, yeah, he's the gambler. And I said, yeah, and I'm gambling right now, riding in this front seat with you around this mountain here.
So obviously Pete Rose has maintained somewhat of a sense of humor. However, it doesn't all seem so funny when this gets going come July 6th. Live from Northern Kentucky, Tom Brenneman, News 5 Sports.
Okay, Tom, a trade, huh? How boring.
Yeah, baseball. Oh, well, we'll get back to you later, right?
Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti is watching these proceedings from New York, of course. In an interview about an hour ago, Giamatti told reporters he's not happy that Judge Nadel released baseball's confidential report.
I didn't decide to release the report. I wanted to keep the report absolutely confidential along with everything else. When it was the subject of the lawsuit, we had to file it in order to defend it. Once it was filed as a public document, eventually these things get released.
Other than that, Giamatti says he is not commenting on the appeal until the hearing is over.
Pulling your kid out of the Little League. The whole thing's starting to give more than a few of us a bad taste. Indeed, the lawyers have taken over baseball, and yesterday the Reds got more TROs than RBIs. It's crying shame, and it needn't be like this. It's time for less law and a little common sense. And see how easy this whole thing could be. I mean, what's the issue here? It's whether Pete bet on baseball or the Reds. And that's a no-no, and Pete knows it is. And there's a good reason for that, because if gamblers get too involved in the game, there'd be too much incentive to fix the games, and the integrity of baseball would be lost. So the rule's good. No betting on baseball. Well, did Pete bet on baseball? The investigator has put together his report. Pete now wants a chance to show that the report's all wrong. And he wants the case heard before an impartial judge. He doesn't think Giamatti's fair. He thinks he's already made up his mind prior to hearing Pete refute the evidence. Judge Nadel, at least to this point, agrees. Meanwhile, Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti says he is fair. He is impartial. He has not yet made up his mind about Pete. This is what the lawyers are arguing about. Well, is Giamatti biased, or can he be fair? Well, how about a little common sense here? Why doesn't Giamatti simply say, look, I'm as honest and fair as the day is long. I have not already determined that Pete is guilty. But since the most important thing here is finding the truth and preserving the integrity of baseball as well as Pete's rights, I'd like to avoid even the appearance of having been biased. I'd like to lift the cloud that will inevitably hover over this case no matter what decision I now reach. So, I'll step aside here, agree not to hear this case, and we'll have baseball appoint somebody else or an agreed-upon panel to hear the evidence, maybe a former federal judge or even a former president. If Bart Giamatti would just say that, he'd be a national hero overnight. He'd have put the game ahead of his pride. Pete would have no excuse for not going ahead with the hearing. Both sides would be heard. The issue would be out of court. The question of Pete's betting finally settled. And once again, we could play ball. It'd be less dollars for the lawyers, but more common sense for the game.
Now, Cincinnati's News 5 tonight.
Good evening. The report which holds the future of Pete Rose is now out. And as its author, John Dowd, said it would, it says Pete bet on baseball. It says he bet on the Reds. Indeed, often to the tune of $2,000 a game.
The 225-page report compiled by the investigator for the commissioner's office bases its findings on a number of interviews, phone records, bank records, and betting sheets, which Pete strongly denies are his, and according to his attorneys, will be clearly refuted once the case is tried on its merits. Now, we secured a copy of the report late this afternoon. News 5's John London has been poring over it and joins us now in the newsroom. John?
Jerry, there is a lot in the report itself that makes for interesting reading, particularly the reference to Pete's bank records. The report says they show Rose wrote checks made out to fictitious people, sent them to a man in New York in order to pay off a New York bookie. But even after poring through the report, it still seems to boil down to who you believe. A big chunk of the report, 72 pages worth, is a chronology of bets allegedly made by Rose during the first 3 months of the 1987 baseball season. According to Dave Morgan, an associate of Ron Peters, that is when Rose would win a lot of money, quote, near the beginning of the baseball season when Cincinnati was winning a lot of games. The key evidence, 3 betting sheets said to be in Rose's handwriting, Paul all-time greats. Jerry?
John, you mentioned the betting sheets as evidence. Where did baseball get those betting sheets?
According to the report from Paul Jansen, who readily admits that he took them from Pete's home.
Wouldn't Jansen's fingerprints then be on the sheets, too?
I suppose they would be. That is certainly an issue that Pete's attorneys will most likely raise, and they will also contend that Pete's handwriting is not on those betting sheets. They say they have their own handwriting experts who are ready to speak up about that when the time comes.
What do they say about the phone records that are in this report?
I would imagine they will probably say prove it. The report is replete with examples of calls that were made from Pete's home, from the hotel room, from the dugout, from Jansen's car phone. The report says betting records from Jansen and Peters detail Pete's gambling. He lost a couple thousand here on the Reds. He won a couple thousand here on the Yankees, etc. But here again, Pete's lawyers will most likely raise the issue of credibility on that one.
Okay, thank you very much. John London, you spend much of the evening poring over this report. We'll continue to look at it. I suspect we're going to hear a lot more about it in the coming days.
While everyone was focusing on the legal issues, Pete was keeping an eye on the Reds tonight.
News 5 Sports Director Ken Brew is down at the stadium with Pete tonight. He joins us now with a report on what Pete said.
It's been a busy night between the Reds and trying to read this thing.
You got that.
I can't remember what I've done other than that tonight. Through all this, Pete is trying to stay focused on the game. During the warm-up tonight, our photographers caught a glimpse of him, putting the troops through a little workout. And then later on, while the team worked on its first win in days. Now, when it was all over, Pete finally told reporters what he really thinks about this report.
No, it's such a biased report, it's unbelievable. But we'll face that. Because there's not a damn thing we can do about it. The laws of baseball are great, but they have to abide by the laws too. And we don't think they did, and that's why we went to court, because we feel he already made judgment. And me and my team evidently aren't the only people who feel that way.
Interesting change of posture for Pete Rose, who for so long said no comment and then was a little defensive, now seems to be firing back. You almost get the feeling that he feels they fired their best shot. Now it's time for him.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ken. Now, I talked with Pete's attorneys tonight, and he expects some negative public reaction, of course, to baseball's report, but he tells me he's confident he can refute every allegation in it, from betting slips to phone records. The major concern of the lawyers is getting a fair decision-maker to hear Pete's case.
Through all the recent legal maneuverings, Ron Peters, who calls himself Pete Rose's bookmaker, has been keeping quiet. But in an exclusive interview with News 5's Steve Forrest, the man known as Pete's chief accuser tells us he won't be the one to bring Pete down.
You're a student of baseball at this point, I'd imagine. You know about the Black Sox. You've also got to know that there are probably going to be people out there already who are saying that you will go down in history as the man who brought down Pete Rose.
Yeah, they're going to say that, but in fact, Pete's the one that brought down Pete Rose, not Ron Peter. He knew what he was doing.
Now, that is just part of what Peter's had to say, but because of an agreement we have with him, this is the only part of the interview we can show you tonight. Pete's lawyer made us promise not to air the full interview until 6 o'clock tomorrow. Please tune in to News 5 at 6 to hear the full exclusive interview. As for Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti, he says making the report public is the last thing he wanted to happen.
I didn't decide to release the report. I wanted to keep the report absolutely confidential along with everything else. When it was the subject of the lawsuit, we had to file it in order to defend it. Once it was filed as a public document, eventually these things get released.
Giamatti refused to answer reporters' questions about the legal maneuvering surrounding this whole battle with Pete.
Now, as far as the battle in court goes, here's where we stand. After Judge Nadel granted the temporary restraining order yesterday, lawyers for the baseball commissioner have now filed an appeal to the ruling. They say the hearing by Giamatti should take place as quickly as possible and that the integrity of the commissioner's office is at stake. Pete's lawyers have until Wednesday morning to file their paperwork. That's when the hearing on the appeal is scheduled.
And you're going to have some thoughts on this whole legal stuff later on. Coming up in these days, but what has all the hype done for the sale of his baseball cards and memorabilia? According to this Price Hill store, the 1989 Rose card is going fast in fear that this may be Pete's last year. Collectors say memorabilia and older Rose cards have been moving kind of slow. I hear those rookie cards going for something like $800 bucks. Fantastic. That's all our time for now. Thanks for being here with us. Appearing as if it's all done.
This is News 5 at 5:30 with Jerry Springer, Norma Rashid, Pat Berry's weather, Ken Brew with sports, and Northern Kentucky Bureau Chief Marty Perret.
Good evening. Another delay tonight in the Pete Rose gambling case. The answer to who will judge Pete has been pushed back for at least another 12 days.
Baseball lawyers want the case handled in federal court. Pete's lawyers want it decided in Hamilton County Court. And the Columbus judge, who has to decide one way or the other, says he won't decide until at least July 17th. News 5's Steve Forrest is in Columbus. He joins us now live. Steve?
Norma, you want a bottom line on this. It's that Pete is apparently safe through at least the All-Star game. There is no way he's going to be tossed out of baseball or even reprimanded through at least July 20th. And his lawyers are working like crazy to make sure that it never happens.
Rose's lawyer, Robert Stackler, arrived at the courthouse shortly after noon, saying nothing.
No comment at this time.
But in the 2-hour private meeting, he and lawyers for both baseball and the Reds worked out an agreement with a federal judge to keep Rose on the job while they decide in which court his case against Giamatti belongs. Here's what it says. Giamatti won't hold any hearing for at least the next 2 weeks on whether Rose should be kicked out of baseball for allegedly gambling on baseball games, including those of the Reds. And the Reds agree they won't fire or suspend him while the federal court decides if it should send the case back to Hamilton County Common Pleas Judge Norbert Nadel.
Bob, are you pleased that the stipulation is there?
Yeah.
Until at least the 17th.
Because it preserves the status quo and it gives Judge Hoshu an opportunity to decide the case and to review the briefs and the law.
And you can go forward without any worry that Rose is going to be suspended or fired once the Judge Nadel's TRO expires.
The stipulation will speak for itself, and they have agreed not to take any action.
Now, both sides still have to file legal papers. The last papers are due on July 17th. That's 12 days from now. And then Judge John Holshoe says he will take the matter under advisement. So this matter has the potential to drag out through the rest of August, very likely into rest of July, very likely into August, quite possibly until October in the World Series. Not good news anyway you look at it. Reporting live from Columbus, Steve Forrest, News 5.
All right, thanks a lot, Steve. And we're preparing more on this latest development and local reaction to it. We'll have that coming
Pete Rose might have his case decided by federal court or by state court, that's Judge Nadel, or by the commissioner. There will ultimately be a decision maker, but some fans have already made up their minds.
I think it's obvious that he's guilty, and it doesn't matter right now anyway. So I believe it should be out of the city of Cincinnati because there's too much public favoritism towards him anyway.
The guy's been framed. You know, I like to see him get off.
Other than Pete Rose and Bart Giamatti, the person most affected by this delay is perhaps Judge Norbert Nadel. I contacted the judge's office this afternoon. They had not even gotten official word of the delay from Columbus. But that delay is official, and so the judge will have to wait, along with Pete, along with Bart, along with the fans, and along with a host of lawyers. Jeff Hirsch, News 5.
To recap what's happened today, a federal judge in Columbus has decided to delay his decision on whether a federal court or a Hamilton County court will hear Pete's case. That means a hearing before Hamilton County Judge Norbert Nadel, set for tomorrow, is now canceled. Judge Nadel was scheduled to decide on a preliminary injunction.
Figures because of his alleged gambling habits.
Specifically with a bookie who may have been a member of the New York's Bonanno crime family. News 5 Steve Forrest is in our newsroom to tell us investigators are busy checking out this latest link. Steve?
Yeah, Norma, this gets more and more disturbing every day. Today, NBC reports that sources have identified the bookie named in the report as Val, a bookie to whom Rose reportedly owed thousands of dollars. Now, while Rose denies dealing with him, NBC says the bookie has direct ties to the mafia. NBC says this man is Val, Richard Troy, a New York bookie indicted earlier this year on gambling charges, along with 33 other men. Rose's former friend, Paul Jansen, says he placed bets with Troy on behalf of Rose. Phone records show Jansen made repeated calls to a number which Troy used in mid-1987. Even more significantly, when police raided Troy's home last October, they seized 2 phone books and a Rolodex. A source familiar with the police investigation says one of the books had the inscription Paul-Rose and listed phone numbers for both Jansen and Jansen's mother. That's important because John Dowd's report into Rose's alleged gambling says Jansen's mother got a phone call threatening her son's life unless he paid off Rose's $68,000 gambling debt to Val. The source says, quoting, "This finishes the loop, meaning it provides a final tie between Rose, Jansen, and Troy." Now, in his interview with John Dowd, Rose denies knowing who Val is. That is the same interview where he admits using a bookie to place football and basketball bets, despite his public statements that he never used a bookie to bet on any sport. Norma?
And then he continues to say he never bet on baseball.
That's right. He says he bet on football, the Super Bowl. He said he bet on the NCAAs 2 years ago, but he says he never bet on hockey, and he definitely...
To be done. Has gotten even more complicated. Lawyers for Baseball Commissioner Bart Giamatti have just filed papers in federal court, suggesting Giamatti is the one who won't get a fair shake if the case is sent back to a county court here. News 5 Steve Forrest is live at the stadium. Steve, this is a new approach they're taking.
Yeah, definitely a new approach. The lawyers for Giamatti are fighting back very hard. They're trying to convince that federal judge in Columbus that he should keep the case and not return it back here to Common Pleas Court. They say if the judge is interested in true fairness, it's the only decision he can make.
One way or the other.
Last night before the All-Star game, Giamatti took the hard line, saying there's no way he'll step aside as judge and jury in the Rose affair.
Bart, at any time, have you considered withdrawing from the investigation?
Me? Absolutely not. No. No.
At any time, was there a compromise solution offered to Pete Rose?
No. No.
And today, his lawyers took the hard line, saying the Rose case should be heard in a federal, not state court. They say the commissioner has the right to investigate and decide whether Rose bet on baseball games, saying gambling is the capital crime of baseball. It infects the game's integrity and sickens honest participants and fans. They're also questioning whether Norbert Nadel, the judge who said Giamatti might be prejudiced against Rose, may be prejudiced himself in favor of Rose. They cite the order from federal Judge Carl Rubin transferring the case to Columbus because of Rose's local fame and notoriety. Plainly, they say, this same local prejudice must weigh much more heavily on a state court judge who must be elected and re-elected by the citizens. If ever it were appropriate to remove a case to the federal court to avoid such local pressures, Giamatti's lawyers conclude, this, they say, is the case. The ultimate issue in the case, say the lawyers for Giamatti, is the commissioner's ability to protect the integrity of baseball. Reporting live from Riverfront Stadium, Steve Forrest, News 5.
I suspect Rose and his lawyers, of course, would disagree.
Yeah, I think that's a real safe assumption, Jerry. As a matter of fact, it's their turn now to respond to the legal brief that was filed today. Those papers have to be filed up in Columbus by next week, next Tuesday, I believe. And at that point, next Monday, rather, at that point, Judge Holshoe will get to make the final decision. Don't expect a quick one.
Came down, he's there now live. Steve, what's this one mean?
Well, it means that the decision shoots a big hole through what's been the major thrust of Rose's defense, as well as his efforts to keep the case before Hamilton County Common Pleas Judge Norbert Nadel. It says when you boil down this case, the argument is between Rose and Commissioner Giamatti and nobody else. And that is what Rose's defenders did not want to hear. The decision is a clear defeat for Rose. 2 weeks ago, his lawyers had argued that the case belonged in state, not federal court, saying the Reds were a necessary defendant, as necessary as Commissioner Giamatti himself. But Judge John Holshoe says in today's decision that Rose fraudulently made the Reds a defendant in the case. He writes, in reality, there is no controversy between Rose and the Cincinnati Reds. Thus, he says, the case belongs in federal court.
I'm very pleased. It would surprise you if I were not, I'm sure, but I'm very pleased.
Giamatti's lawyer, Lou Hoynes, got the good news here in Columbus. He called Holshue's decision perfectly correct. But in Cincinnati, Rose's lawyer and friend Reuben Katz issued a statement saying, "We have not yet reviewed Judge Holshue's extensive opinion. We will do so in the next day or so. Then we will decide on our course of action." Probably include an appeal to the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals in Cincinnati. So the irony here is that the case will probably come back to Cincinnati sometime very soon, although definitely not to the courtroom that Rose would have liked. Reporting live in Columbus, Steve Forrest, News 5.
Steve, what happens to that order that the Reds are prevented from taking any disciplinary action against Pete? What happens to that now?
It's going to be extended for 2 weeks to August 14th by Judge Holshue's orders. That would probably be the day, if there's no appeal, that the hearing on the preliminary injunction would go before Judge Holshue.
All right, thanks a lot, Steve. Of course, we're still gathering reaction to this big decision, and we'll have that for you on News 5 coming up at 6.
Joins us now. He's been listening to a lot of the comments and is here now to share them with us.
Talk about deja vu, huh?
Yeah.
How many rulings now for Pete? It seems countless. We've had court rulings on Pete, it seems like all summer long. The whole legal battle starting to become as long as the season itself. And the arguments are becoming as familiar as the starting lineup. Now, here's what everyone is saying today.
Right off the bat, the reaction from Pete is pretty predictable. Here's his quote. "I want an impartial decision maker. The rest is up to the lawyers. Today's decision doesn't affect me one way or the other." The other main player in all this, the baseball commissioner, Bart Giamatti, had this to say.
Well, I've always thought it belonged in the federal courts, and so I think that that's the appropriate place.
Is this a setback for Pete?
Well, I think it is a setback for Pete Rose in that it delays the issue of whether or not this is heard in state court. The interesting thing about Judge Holshue's ruling is that he has allowed Pete Rose's attorneys to appeal his decision.
When asked about that today, Pete's attorney, Reuben Katz, would only make this statement, and it's a quote. "We have not yet reviewed Judge Holshue's extensive opinion. We will do so in the next day or so. Then we will decide on our next course of action." Meanwhile, the public seems to want this over with.
I think it'll get a fair review now that it's in federal court, and there won't be as much, let's call it community pressure, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
I think they're just stalling for time. His lawyers are just stalling for time.
I think that it should go to federal court. I hope that everything comes out as fairly as possible and back Pete all the way.
One more reaction we need to pass along, this from Marge Schott, who says she just hopes the situation is resolved soon and that the players and fans can get back to enjoying the game of baseball, which I think is pretty much a universal acclamation. How realistic, I don't know. It will go on at least until the 14th of August.
The amazing thing here is all this legal stuff has to do with whether and who's going to find out whether or not Giamatti is biased or not. None of this has to do with whether or not Pete gambled on baseball.
And it certainly doesn't preclude the deal that we've been talking about here tonight that may or may not come off before this thing goes back
to
his court.
Okay. And the story over the weekend. It quotes Pete as saying he bet sports other than baseball with a bookie, saying it was more of a convenience than anything else. He admitted it may be illegal, but said, "I'm not the only one who's doing something wrong." Bart Giamatti's assistant commissioner, Faye Vincent, says they may have to take new action against Rose, adding Rose's admissions, if it were any other person, would be subject to actions by baseball. Well, News 5 spoke with Pete Rose today about that article. He says he doesn't understand all the uproar. He was only elaborating on deposition testimony that was already made public. His only regret is using the word convenient.